And we are in our third week in Mark chapter 5. And last week we were looking at the second half of this chapter that had kind of these two stories that kind of sandwich each other. We have the story of the Jairus coming and approaching Jesus and asking for that healing ministry. Then we had and Jesus doing that healing ministry. And then in between that story, kind of in the middle of it, we got the story of the woman with the bleeding disorder. And we kind of made it through that part of it, that second story sandwiched in, but we didn't quite make it, all the way through this story. And so I want to pick back up, and as we look at this, verses 21 through 34 is what we discussed at length last week. And so I wanted to make sure that are there any other questions or things that you guys thought of as we kind of went about our week that you'd want to add in before we dive into the rest of the pericope, or some other thought that you had that you want to bring to light?
Yeah, Sam.
Yeah. Go ahead, Dennis.
I don't know much about that area, and maybe you do through your theology classes, but it seems to me like there's a big contrast.
You turn your microphone off.
The home base of where Christ was versus the area of the Gerasenes.
Right.
Like across the railroad tracks difference.
This area, as we kind of discussed this a little bit last week, but I'll add this in. This area was primarily settled by Hellenized peoples. These were not Jewish per se, though there were Jews around there. It was the notion of across the other side of the railroad tracks probably goes a little bit further than what I would feel comfortable going under as a normal description, but it might be the difference between saying like the people who grew up in Tipton versus people who grew up in downtown Indy. Does that make sense?
Yeah, a little bit.
The people of the Decapolis, being more Hellenistic, would have allowed far more of that Roman culture, that Greek culture into their community, and would have had no problem with a plethora of ideas and concepts kind of being all around them. Whereas the Jewish people as a whole tended to be insular. They tended to, because of the fear of being tainted or being made unholy or wanting, they often would shun the Gentiles. They didn't really want to have a whole lot to do with them. That's, as we talked about 2 weeks ago with the story of the man with the legion of demons, the simple fact that they had a herd of pigs would have caused most Jewish people to not want to have anything to do with them. It's kind of, maybe not to the same extent, but I almost think of the Jewish people acting in the way we kind of look at Amish today. Not quite that far, but if you weren't a part of their community, they would be leery of doing business with you until you proved that you were not going to paint them. Does that make sense?
Yeah, the research I read, most of them just flat out called them pagans.
Right. Oh, yeah. I mean, where I grew up, the Amish community, they referred to us as English. It was very clearly we were a different group of people. We did not hold their values. We did not understand their culture. They would associate with us when it was necessary. They would go to our schools only if it was absolutely necessary. They would do business with us only when it stayed within the boundaries of their faith. And so there is a sense in which that's probably a closer understanding, looking at like the Amish community that's just to the north and east of Kokomo, and then people who live in Kokomo. That might be a better a dichotomy of the people of Galilee being more like the Amish, and then the people of the Decapolis being more like the city dwellers of Kokomo.
Okay.
It's not an exact parallel, but that's probably a pretty, I mean, Kevin, wouldn't you think that that probably gets at the way that the Jewish people looked at Gentiles?
Yeah. Great.
You would have some Jews who would associate a little bit more with non-Jews, but because, I mean, the word Gentile means other believing at its root meaning. And so it's like, you guys are just weird. You guys are foreigners. You don't understand the truth. Anything else?
Oh, how does Gentile contrast with pagan?
If I understand the root words, Gentile is a Hebrew word and pagan is a Latin word. But essentially it's also the same word that gets thrown around as barbarian. All three of these words kind of carry that same connotation. You don't think like us, you don't worship like us, you don't act like us. You're the other. Does that make sense, John? That doesn't mean uncivilized. That doesn't mean that they're not very wise. It has none of that connotation. It's purely you're different than me. Yeah, it's all a cultural piece. We have added on a lot more than what they might have, though for the Jewish people, calling someone a Gentile meant that you were also outside of the covenant. So that for the Jewish understanding, it has a little bit more of a layer to it on top of than just the term pagan or barbarian. But essentially it means other. Does that
The
help?
Japanese have a word for the non-Japanese as well. Gaijin.
Many
So it's-
cultures do.
Yeah, another insular culture. Yeah, exactly.
And so that's kind of, we have, because of Christianity and because of our scriptures and the trying to understand that Hebrew culture. I mean, if you look at especially the book of Acts, as Paul starts to use the word Gentile, and Paul will all but kind of make a delineation between there's Jews, Gentiles, and then non-believers. Sometimes the English translation will say Jew, Greek, and non-believers, and they might throw that term pagan in there even, because Paul's trying to separate out that there are Hebrew believers and Greek and Latin believers, and then there are non-believers. He's trying to move, and so we in our culture today, when our Bibles use the term Gentile, it's more speaking about non-believer. But for the Jewish people, when they use the term Gentile, it meant non-Jew.
Okay, so I've never minded being called a Gentile, but is pagans put in that? That's how they looked at Gentiles, is that we're pagans? I mean, now I don't like paganism. I mean, to me, we shouldn't be in the same category, but did they put us together?
Pagan and paganism are two different things. So at its root, a pagan was a non-local person. But paganism comes with a set of beliefs and a set of gods and a way of being. So yeah, Patty, being real honest, we don't have anything to do with paganism, but there are some cultures who, even as Christians, they would call us pagans because we are not insiders. Does that make sense? Now, the cultures that would have done that, most of those have been completely absorbed into the Western world. And so that word doesn't mean that anymore. But at its root, that's what it meant. It was the outsider. It was the other.
Wikipedia says a pagan is a polytheistic person or non-Christian.
And that's because the term has taken on that connotation now, but it used to be the other. Think of it, we were actually in the early centuries of Christianity, Christians were called atheists because we didn't believe in the other gods.
And there's the other side of that, that paganism was what most of the Gentiles practiced. They practiced Greek mythology, Roman mythology, Babylonian, Persian. I mean, all those other cultures that practiced so many different gods, that would have been paganism. And the Jewish way the Jewish people looked at them. So
Probably if we were to be as literal as possible, most of the world of the Bible were pantheists. They believed in a whole bunch of different gods and a whole bunch of different faiths, and they didn't see them as necessarily competing faiths. They would see them as parallel faiths. And so the reason that Judaism and Christianity were so ostracized is because they said those other gods aren't even real. You're putting faith in something that's not at all real. Whereas the pagans or the Greeks or the Romans or whatever, they would just see the Jewish God Yahweh as another god alongside their pantheon. Do you get what I'm saying, Patty? And so they would call a pagan someone who's outside of that thinking.
So if you watch The Chosen season 4, Peter and Gaius get into a discussion about their different religions. And Gaius names off all the different gods that they worshiped and how they worked out. And Peter said, we only have one God. And so that's the big difference between the Jewish people, and monotheism was their thing, and everybody else pretty much was polytheistic. So.
And this is an important line of questioning to help us understand the Gospels and what we're reading. Because when you get into a region like the Decapolis, they're polytheistic. They believe in lots of gods. The Canaanites, the Phoenicians, the Syrians, they all believed in lots of gods. They would have no problem believing in Yahweh. They would probably even have no problem believing that Jesus was a god. But the problem comes in for the Jewish people who are monotheistic and say there's only one God. Then the Jews would be more apt to take Jesus and the Christ followers and make us pagans. They would call us Gentiles, us non-believers, as opposed to accepting that Jesus is the Son of God. Does that make sense?
Yep.
And so that cultural dichotomy of what we read on the Decapolis side really did change how Jesus approached what he taught while he was there. When we come back to the northern side of the Sea of Galilee, we have, as we picked up in Mark chapter 5, where you have Jairus, who's the leader of a synagogue. Now we're talking about monotheistic people again. Now, how Jesus talks to them is going to be different. What he says to them is going to be different. It's kind of like that language that Kevin brought out last time about when he calls the woman with the bleeding disorder, my daughter. There, he is he is using language that would be very clearly understood by a Jewish people. A polytheistic people, they wouldn't use that language because there were lots of daughters and sons of the gods. That was not a big deal. And oftentimes, they would almost have the notion that most people probably could trace a level of their ancestry back to someone who was partially, a demigod of sorts. But that's not what's going on here. Jesus is not claiming to be the son of a god, as in he is a demigod, a half god. He is saying he is God incarnate. He is God's son, begotten, not made, as we talk about when we say the creeds. And so that changes this. And for Jairus to ask him to come do this, this is bare minimum acknowledging that Jesus is a prophet, and Jesus was a prophet. But it's also putting far more stock in him than just a prophet. The woman who's seeking to be healed. We have lots of healings in the Old Testament. We have lots of healings by prophets in the Old Testament. But this is a woman who is unclean in a way that we don't see that healing anywhere else in Scripture. We see Naaman, who has leprosy and therefore unclean, be healed. And we've already seen Jesus heal a leper here in Mark's gospel. But this is a different healing yet. Leprosy is an external disease. A bleeding disorder, this is an internal disease. Any other thoughts or questions before we hop back into Scripture?
Just for reference, Sam, I sent it to you. History shows that the boats that they were on had a square sail. They could sail just as easily at night as they could during the day. And they went between 4 to 6 kilometers per hour if you had good winds. It points out that if you had a crosswind or a headwind, unless you were a very experienced sailor, you did not leave port. And it was about 20 kilometers across where they went.
Yeah, so you're talking about, it's about 13 miles, about 21 kilometers north to south. And so realistically, as this, going back even into chapter 4, we're talking about actually all the way back.
There's several times they crossed.
Yeah, they crossed a couple times, but from Jesus appointing the 12 in Mark chapter 3 to where we're at in Mark chapter 5, this whole section is probably less than 36 hours so far.
If you don't have headwinds.
At bare minimum, chapter 4 and 5 are in the same 24 to 36 hour period. 13 miles for us going north and south across Howard County. You can do that in no time at all. But in a boat, it's a little bit different story. If no other questions or thoughts or things to bring to bear, then we'll pick back up at, actually, you know what? I'm going to go ahead and read 21 through 35 so that we can get our context again. So Mark chapter 5, verse 21 and following. When Jesus had again crossed over by boat to the other side of the lake, a large crowd gathered around him while he was by the lake. Then one of the synagogue leaders named Jairus came, and when he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet. He pleaded earnestly with him, "My little daughter is dying. Please come and put your hands on her so that she will be healed and live." So Jesus went with him. A large crowd followed him and pressed around him, and a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. She had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all she had, yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. When she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, because she thought, "If I just touch his clothes, I will be healed." Immediately, her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. At once, Jesus realized that power had gone out from him. He turned around in the crowd and asked, "Who touched my clothes?" "You see the people crowded against you," his disciples answered, "and yet you can ask, 'Who touched me?'" But Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. Then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet, and trembling with fear, told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering." While Jesus was still speaking, some people came from the house of Jairus, the synagogue leader. "Your daughter is dead," they said. "Why bother the teacher anymore?" So, verse 35, while Jesus was still speaking, some people came from the house of Jairus, the synagogue leader. "Your daughter is dead," they said. "Why bother the teacher anymore?" So our three questions that we ask every week. What do you notice? What questions does that make you ask? And what's the significance of that reality? So what stands out to you, or what did you notice in verse 35 as we put it in context?
It implies Christ did not go directly to Jairus, his house.
Yeah, there's enough time between when Jairus left his house to ask Jesus. He found Jesus, asked this question, and was bringing Jesus back. And we have this interchange between Jesus and the woman was bleeding. There's enough time here that a major development changed in his daughter. She died.
My heart
What else?
just goes out to Jairus because, and that I didn't catch it the first time, but did you see how it said he fell at Jesus's feet? He didn't bow. He didn't crouch low. He fell, utter
Yeah.
desperation and exasperation and helplessness and everything that implies. And now they're telling him, never mind, it's done.
How do you think Jairus must have felt about the woman who got the healing? Do you think he would be angry because she distracted Jesus from getting to the house in time?
That would be the human reaction, wouldn't it?
Unless he's still believing that Jesus could do something, but there's probably that thought probably entered his mind. Yeah.
Well,
No, we haven't had anybody raised from the dead yet, so that's a fair point. You know, we haven't seen Jesus do that particular miracle. And so there's a sense in which the people who are coming to give this report to Jairus, they're not necessarily saying anything wrong. Yeah. We have Elijah, Elisha, and then the dead remnants of Elisha that all raised someone from the dead. So it's not unheard of, but it's not common. What were you going to say, Cindy?
Well, the statement, why bother the teacher anymore? They must have, whomever that came out of the house must have understood exactly what Jairus was doing. And to a certain extent, must have believed as well. Because they're saying, well, don't, she's dead, don't bother him anymore,
The notion of being able to heal, which they did not doubt that as a possibility, is gone. Now, the other side of that, though, and what stood out to me is, as I was reading it this time, notice as Kevin said, the three stories that we have in the Old Testament bringing someone back from the dead, those were very clearly prophets. What do they call Jesus? They call him a teacher. They don't call him a prophet. They know that that's the ability that prophets have, but they don't call him a prophet. They call him a teacher.
And I'm pretty sure this is the first raising of the dead by Jesus, because at the end of this chapter, or this part of the chapter, he tells them not to say anything. So I'm pretty sure this is the first time.
Yeah, this, in Mark's gospel, as we're going to see as we get to the end of this story, Jesus tells them not to tell anybody. So this really is the first raising of the dead in Mark's gospel. But I just find it interesting that they call him the teacher. They don't call him Messiah. They don't call him a prophet. So it speaks to what they know is true about him. They know that he is a good and wise teacher. And it almost speaks to what they think is probably the more important task. Teaching is a more important task than the prophetic and healing.
Well, the teaching was more important to Jesus than all of it.
Yeah. And yes, you're right, Kevin. As he said, teaching for Jesus was more important than the miracles. That's why we had a whole chapter in Mark in chapter 4 of him teaching in parables to try and help people to understand the kingdom. Anything else you notice in verse 35?
I've got a question about the teacher. Okay.
Yeah.
In so much as the educational portion of that time,
Okay.
you had to go through, all these hurdles to be called a teacher. So are they saying that and recognizing him as a teacher of their time, having gone through the different educational hierarchy or whatever you want to call it, having completed that? Is that how they're recognizing him, or is there something else that they're using to call him teacher?
So I'm looking at the Greek here, and if I understand it, it's the same word that Hebrews would have used for rabbi.
So they did believe. So they did believe he went through the educational process to get the title of teacher.
They recognize within him the wisdom to call him the teacher or rabbi. Whether or not he went through the schooling to do that, think of it this way. The title preacher today or pastor today, in our system in the Global Methodist Church, there's a level of education that is required before a person can be called a pastor. There's a level of vetting that is required, but not all churches require that. I remember the day that I got ordained, my uncle came up to me and he goes, well, I got ordained too. And he was ordained in the Unchained gang. It was a motorcycle gang that they preached the gospel. that understanding of ordination was different in his group than it was in mine. But in general, you're right, Cindy, the Jewish people didn't call just anybody rabbi. There was a bare minimum. In general, you expected them to have gone to school to be a rabbi. And it wasn't just enough to go to school, but you had to actually show the wisdom and the knowledge to be a rabbi. So essentially, they're acknowledging something about Jesus that implies that. You're right. Kevin, what were you going to say?
My mic. So they weren't ready to acknowledge him as the Christ yet, the Messiah. So teacher they could live with teacher. You know what I'm saying? And if this is the first time he raises anyone from the dead, they don't have any concept of that yet. I mean, they don't have any concept of Jesus being able to raise anybody. Healing people maybe, because he's healed several people in this area, but he's not raised anyone from the dead yet. So at this point in time, they're not looking for him to do that.
You know, that's a really good point to make. What were you going to say, Patty? Go ahead.
I was just, I have the New King James Version, and it says master. So what's the difference or the similarities between master and teacher or rabbi?
If I remember correctly, and I could be wrong on this, and maybe Kevin might be able to shed some more light on it, but you had priests in the Jewish faith, and they had to come from the family of Levi. If they were a spiritual leader, but not a priest, then they could get the term rabbi. The New King James Version is going from the King James Version, and they used the term master in the way that master was utilized in the early 1600s, which is to say someone worthy of being followed, someone worthy of respect, someone you should pay attention to, which is the same connotation that a rabbi held for the Jewish people, even if the term master carries with it now a little bit different. Master now has more of an overlord kind of understanding because of how the language has developed. And so that's why a lot of other translations go to teacher instead of master, Patty. But I think that they're getting at the same concept. They acknowledge that Jesus is somebody to follow. Go ahead, Kevin.
The other side of that is with the Hebrew and the Greek, oftentimes a word could mean several different things. And what we pick as translators, sometimes we pick what we think it should be there compared to what maybe actually fits better. So, I mean, when you talk about master, so whoever translated the King James might have chose that because in their culture that would have been acceptable, whereas other people would go more with teacher. So, I mean, that's just a hypothetical, but I'm just saying that could be the reason why one version says master and one version says teacher.
But is it safe to say that this particular synagogue, the ruler of the synagogues, well, I'm reading the New King James, the ruler of the synagogue's house, certain, which said, thy daughter is dead, why troublest thou the master? So apparently, maybe this particular synagogue were believers of, or followers, I should say, well, believers, I guess, of Jesus Christ, because they seem to recognize him as a master or teacher or rabbi that could possibly, they apparently knew that the ruler was going to try to find Jesus to heal his daughter. So they must have all respected Jesus enough. Or is this just his family? Maybe.
Also, if Jairus was a believer, which he must have been, then I would think his family would be as well.
So a couple of things. Just because one person is a believer doesn't mean that the rest of their family is. We all know that. Now, in general, culturally speaking, if one member of the family was a non-believer, that would not look negative. It would look negative on the head of the family if the family was considered a believing family. So there is that reality that you can't necessarily assume that everybody believes, but because of the cultural ties, how the extended family was much closer knit for the Jewish community, in general, what the leader of the family believed, the rest of the family probably would believe. Now, again, that probably looks more like the way the Amish do it than the way we talk about belief. You know, my kids are all Christians, but how they practice their faith is different than the way I do. You know, one goes to a non-denominational church, one goes to a brethren church. You know, they have a different variety, but I would say that they're all believing. In the Amish community, you'd have some who might show faith. They would all go to church together when they're hosting, but they may not necessarily live the same way the rest of the time. And to Patty's point, I went ahead and I looked up the Greek word for Lord or master, and that's kurios. And so that has more of a political connotation when you talk about master. And so the Greek word that's used here, didaskalon, it would be the teacher. Now, it could mean like the headmaster of the school. So there's a level of importance to this teaching. So it might be, as I think Kevin has pointed out before, because I know he's done a little bit more study in that side of it. You know, the synagogue would be for just a small cluster of families. So, you know, there could have been a couple of synagogues or even 3 or 4 synagogues in Capernaum at that time. And so each of them could have more than one rabbi, though oftentimes they'd only have one. If there was a larger synagogue, you might have the head rabbi. And I think that there is a sense here, and because Jairus, who's the head of the synagogue, is going to Jesus and kind of acknowledging Jesus's position, they're using more this term of didaskalon as like the head teacher, the high teacher, the schoolmaster of sorts. So I think that that's probably why the King James uses the term master there, if that makes sense.
And with
Yes,
Capernaum
and
being a
so,
big major city, it could also have had a rabbinical school in it where several people were being trained to be rabbis. I mean,
Mhm.
you don't know, you know, I
Well,
mean,
what's a,
I don't know that there's any evidence of that, but
hmm, well, what's a ruler of the synagogue? So, I mean, to me, that means he runs the show or he's the head, like, I mean, do they interchange ruler and priest, or are there,
CEO,
he's,
manager, take care of all the paperwork and monies and all that stuff.
so he was well respected, or,
So in our context, probably the closest example of this would be that Jairus would be the chairman of the church council. He would do the work like what Carol is as a trustee of the church and what Cindy's doing as the treasurer. You guys still there?
Oh, there. Now I'm gonna figure out.
Turn on the TVs.
So
Can you guys still hear me?
while we're waiting on that,
Yes.
to simplify it would be, just like what you would have in a school or whatever, you have your master, you know, the big wig person that runs the school, the principal or whatever. There's other words for it also, and then you go down the line. And in this situation, I'm taking it that maybe God is the master here in all of this, and then Jesus is the teacher, because he's gonna be teaching and training the disciples, right? And then you have other people in between. Cause don't they call him teacher?
They call him teacher, which they're talking more about his ability as a spiritual guide and leader. Jairus, as the head of the synagogue, he is not going to be a person who necessarily teaches the word, but he is the administrator for that local congregation. You know, his job would be to make sure that the lights got paid. If they had, he would make sure that the place got clean.
Right,
He's gonna do the work like trustees do in the church today
right,
and the finance committee. But he would have to be a very trusted individual before they would give him that level of authority. You know, it's not a minor thing. But it's not necessarily a spiritual leader or a spiritual teacher.
but they still had to have, even back then, to become one of these positions in the church, you had to have the training.
Yes,
You know, so somebody, you know, you go down that line and you have that training.
he would have absolutely had a level of training. He would have been seen as someone that was trustworthy. He probably would have shown an aptitude within the synagogue. You know, you gotta understand how the synagogue works and what they believe before you are allowed to have that level of trustedness. He would be the one who relates to the temple in Jerusalem. He's the one who would make sure that the offerings and tithes that were given to the local synagogue got sent on. You know, so he understands their belief system. He can navigate their belief system. He has a level of administrative prowess. And he was seen as someone who is trusted. So all of that together, if he, as the trusted leader of this local body of believers, prostrates himself, submits himself to Jesus, then they would absolutely see his servants, the ones who follow him, would understand Jesus's position as something of power and authority.
Right.
Submit. There's two different ones.
Well, I don't know
Here.
why it's just like that when it goes blank. Yeah, well, they're on the computer, everything's fine on the computer.
Can you guys see us online?
Yes,
Yeah,
And it's on the computer.
It's just, these are not.
And the two TVs up front do not automatically go to HDMI 1.
Yeah, I got it fixed now.
Hey,
Can you guys hear me or do I need the mic?
Can hear you.
All right. So yeah, the reality is that Jairus' servants would trust Jairus. Jairus is trusting in Jesus. The fact that they're calling him a teacher is absolutely showing a level of respect, but as Kevin said, we haven't seen a miracle yet to elevate him to the level of prophet. And we definitely haven't seen anybody call him Messiah. Does that make sense?
So we did have somebody talking Messiah or Son of God, and that was the demoniac.
But that was across the river too, I mean, not the river, but on the other side of the lake.
Right.
The Jairus and his servants would not have had that experience to hear this demoniac call him the Son of God. And so therefore, this is, I just brought that out because this is bestowing a level of respect on Jesus. Even if it's not showing, even if it's not going all the way to where Jesus actually holds standing. Does that make sense? Similar story, in 2019, Melissa and I went to St. Louis for the special called General Conference. And we were in line for lunch one day and we were talking to this guy from Europe. And I could tell he had an accent that was Eastern European. And we were just kind of talking and enjoying things, and come to find out, it was a bishop of the church. He was a bishop, I can't remember what his last name was, but we were just kind of talking and we felt each other out enough to realize that we were both there for the conference, and so that became pretty easy to distinguish. And then as we were talking, it became clear that we were both clergy, and so and I didn't treat him any differently. But then as we became clergy, as we're talking about the fact of being clergy in the church, then all of a sudden it became very clear as he was talking that he knew far more than most clergy did. And so then I got to the place where finally someone else came up to him and they said, "Good to see you, Bishop." And it's like, oh, okay, this is something different. You get what I'm saying? I don't think that Jairus' servant here, whether like Patty's that says master or mine that says teacher, they're not trying to downplay who Jesus is. They're trying to show him respect. But it also is clear that they don't have the understanding of him as Messiah yet. That's one of the big things I wanted to point out.
Sure.
Did she?
Yeah. Yesterday.
Anything else?
Getting back to the lady that was touching his garment.
Sure, Robert.
She fell down in total fear. Is that because if you were unclean and you touched a rabbi, would there be some real punishment?
Very well could be punished. She could be stoned for that. I mean, this is not just temporary uncleanness, this is long-standing uncleanness. And most of the people knew that she was unclean. So yeah, Robert, she has been healed and she knows it, but she also realizes that on a technicality, she has done something that was religiously illegal.
All right.
But she's willing to submit to him and whatever comes from it, which is why she prostrates herself, yes, falling at his feet. Now that's also a good point. So she trusts enough that he has the ability to heal her, that her putting herself at his mercy, that she's going to be okay.
So in the same token, Jairus could have believed that Christ would heal her daughter without even going to his house. But I think Christ chose to go and wake her up in his terms.
If we go back to chapters 2 and 3, have we had a healing? Or even just 1, 2, and 3?
Heal the lepers.
In healing the lepers, Jesus heals
Blind man.
the word, but he is face to face with the guy.
Right.
Healing the paralyzed man in chapter 2. It's a word, but again, he's in face to face, so there's probably a level of, it's not a doubt, but there's this level of understanding that Jesus's healing has come for people who are right there with him. Is that what you're getting at, Dennis?
I'm just saying, we know he had the power that he could have healed, not being there in person. But because he went, he was able to show them that he could do that.
They hadn't done that yet.
But he hasn't shown that level of power yet.
No, he hasn't done a long distance.
In Mark's gospel, we haven't seen that yet. So
Right.
to a certain degree, we don't want to diminish Jairus's faith by not just asking Jesus to heal his daughter, but by saying, come and heal her. Because in general, healing was a person-to-person physical thing that happened. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Well, let's take the next word, because this kind of gets at what you're getting at there, Dennis. Verse 36 says, overhearing what they said, Jesus told him, don't be afraid, just believe.
Yep.
I find it interesting that Jesus doesn't tell the servant this, he tells Jairus this. Jairus is the one who came to him believing Jesus could heal. Now you have another report that his daughter is dead. And Jesus doesn't dispute the claim of death, but he encourages Jairus to keep believing. How hard is it at times for us to just keep believing?
It's on a situation.
Depends on the situation. In general, whenever I hear somebody has died, I assume they're dead.
Yeah.
That's the end of the story. I have yet to experience someone literally being brought back to the dead by faith. I've seen CPR and you know, movies and things like that, but in general, the report that someone is, who is that famous person that said reports of my death have been greatly exaggerated? You know, that rarely happens.
I believe that was Mark Twain.
Is that Mark Twain? Samuel Clements?
There's also one of the movies. I can't remember who was that. Felt like it was dead.
Now, the other thing I noticed in this verse is overhearing. That's how this verse starts for me in the NIV. Jesus overheard this. We need to not forget that there is a crowd of people, and Jesus did a miraculous healing. So I bet there was a lot of commotion. And so overhearing would not just be something simple to do. Just a thought. But Jesus being God, he even knows people's thoughts. Any other thoughts, or keep going?
I've got a thought from what you said, going back to him healing her. Wouldn't there have been like a commotion because of, you know, her touching him?
Well, especially once he drew attention to the fact. You know, there would have been a lot of people And probably a lot of people around Jesus who knew that she had this bleeding disorder and knew that she was unclean, and here Jesus just proclaimed her well. So I think there would have been a lot of commotion. And another person coming up, doesn't matter that they were Jairus' servant, probably would have been unnoticed by the crowd, and they would have been talking, and there would have been a lot of commotion. So I think that it's interesting that they acknowledge Jesus overheard this. Yeah, I think you're right, Cindy, there would have been a lot of commotion.
There was a lot of commotion there, and he was doing what he was supposed to be doing at that time. When she touched him, he felt power leave him, right?
Yes.
So that's when, and she shouldn't have been there in the first place, but she was there because of all the commotion. You know, did nobody notice that she was there at that time because of that?
Well, it's kind of, like stage performance, sleight of hand. They misdirection. If you make a big enough commotion over here, you don't see what's going on over here.
Yes.
And so she is hoping that this commotion of Jesus, that she can kind of slip in, touch his clothes, get healed and move away. And of course, that
It
doesn't
didn't
happen.
happen because Jesus noticed.
So on the one hand, you have Jesus noticing the power leaving him. And then right here, you have Jesus noticing what's said, even in the midst of all the rest of the commotion. So Jesus has the ability to sense power, and Jesus has the ability to hear beyond the commotion.
And if I'm not mistaken, if I read it correctly somewhere, it was her faith.
Yeah,
He said right there, he said,
Yeah.
daughter, your faith has made you well.
Your faith, so she believed, she truly believed if she could just get in there and touch the hem of his garment, she could be healed.
so where Jairus wants Jesus to come into his daughter's presence and bring healing, the woman says, I just need to get into Jesus's presence.
What?
And so this is showing two different sides of healing.
But I think Jairus truly believes that if he could just get Jesus there, his daughter would be healed.
Absolutely.
So it's his faith that gets his daughter healed then.
Yeah.
Which is exactly why Jesus says, don't be afraid, just believe.
Yes.
Be what?
You're afraid, just believe.
Basically, keep believing, because it was his belief that got him up to that point. And Jesus just wanted him to continue to believe, even though they said he was dead, because eventually he says, she's not dead, she's sleeping. And then everybody kind of laughs at him.
The Greek doesn't say just believe, it says only believe. So it's more along the lines of what you were saying there, Kevin. It's keep believing. Don't worry about this other report. You've come to me, you've asked for healing, I've said I will go. Only believe.
Do you think he only that he separated himself from the crowd, and my Bible says that he suffered no man to follow him save Peter and James and John, the brother of James, to keep the faith, to keep the unbelievers? Because apparently, she's still quote unquote dead, by the time they get there. Nothing's changed until he gets there.
Well, let's read
Well, there's also that whole concept of 3 witnesses. You need at least 2 to 3 witnesses. So he's keeping, and he wants to keep it on the down low because he's not ready for this to be a public demonstration yet.
Well, let's read the next paragraph so we can get there. 37 through the first part of verse 40. He did not let anyone follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they came to the house of the synagogue leader, Jesus saw a commotion, with people crying and wailing loudly. He went in and said to them, while this commotion and wailing, the child is not dead, but asleep. But they laughed at him. And the point that Kevin was just making is Peter, James, and John is 3 witnesses. You only had to have 2 witnesses to convict someone. So a 3rd witness makes it, plus Jairus' family, there are more than enough witnesses here. What was the point you were trying to make there, Patty?
Well, I was thinking, because there was such a big crowd and he healed the woman, but then when he wants to heal the girl, he chases everybody out,
Did.
you know. And they,
No, but he only says she's sleeping.
I know.
yeah, but he's, you know, so there's no evidence of her being alive yet.
So
Although,
the first question is, what do you notice? So you're noticing that Jesus is sending them out. Kevin notices that there's 3 witnesses from his disciples. The second question is that I always ask is, what does that make you ask? What question? Why is Jesus sending everybody out? Well, he, to a certain degree, as Kevin said, he's keeping enough people there to bear witness to what's about ready to happen. And Jesus says, the child is not dead, she's asleep.
Yes.
The significance, the third question I always ask, and this is where Bible study gets really important. What is the significance of this reality? Jesus is performing a miracle here. He's going to perform a miracle, but he doesn't perform it for the crowd. Miracles are not for the crowd. It's not about the show. Jesus keeps enough people there that they will collaborate. What's the word? Corroborate the story. Jairus will tell the story. Jairus' wife will tell the story. The child will have the story, but the child's not old enough to speak for herself, and it's a girl, right? You know, so there's lack of. But you have Peter, James, and John. Now, just in case people would say, well, they're lying because they're all Jesus's disciples, you've got Jairus there. But the people who are wailing and making a commotion, the people who believe that this child is dead, he gets rid of them. This miracle is not because of a group of people's faith. It's not because of Jairus' household's faith, because they're acknowledging this girl has died. The significance of this reality is Jesus is doing this because Jairus only believed. He continued to believe in spite of the report from his own servant that his daughter had died. Jairus had believed in Jesus for healing, but he didn't think he had to believe in Jesus for resurrection. For returning someone from the dead. And Jesus has said, that faith that you put into me for that I could heal your daughter, understand that hasn't changed. Don't let go of that. I will still heal your daughter. Do you get the reality that this picture is trying to paint?
So is that where they get the concept of soul sleep?
Yes, I think so.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear what you said.
So Melissa just asked the question for those of you online who maybe couldn't hear her. She said, is that where they get the reality, the notion of soul sleep? Oh, boy.
Sorry, you want me to cover these things,
Okay, you said soul what?
Sleep. Like when you die, your soul sleeps until you are present again with Christ.
Or the fact that our bodies are sleeping and our souls are in heaven with God. I mean, there's that whole concept, but the reality is, as pastors, we tell people they really aren't gone. They are, the body is waiting for the soul to come back and meet up with them.
So
Sorry. you just
No,
pushed
no,
the
I'm just trying to think of how to say what I want to say. You know, there is a whole lot of theology around what happens when an individual dies. There's a lot of beliefs around it. There's a lot of ink that has been spilled around this reality. And you know, part of it stems from some superstition. Today, we know that a person is dead once their heart stops beating, their lungs stop breathing, and their brain no longer works. You can lose function of most of your body, but you're still alive so long as those three things are done. We talk about there are people who are brain dead, right? Their heart is still beating, their lungs are still breathing, but because their brain is no longer functioning, doctors will say they're not coming back. There are people who are in comas that their heart is beating, their lungs are breathing, and there's still brain activity, even though their body doesn't work. So in our world today, a person is only dead if they are clinically dead. And that means one of those three things has happened. Their lungs aren't working, their heart isn't working, or their brain isn't working. That's our modern understanding of death, correct?
It means all of those three things.
But the reality that one of those three things happens, we understand that the likelihood of coming back from that is almost nil. It is considered miraculous for a person to come back from being brain dead. It is miraculous for a person's heart to stop beating for longer than 6 minutes and then to come back. You know, there's just, we have this understanding of clinical death. For the Jewish people and for most people of that day, you could look dead, but not be dead until you were dead for at least 3 days.
Wow.
Starting to smell,
Say that again.
starting to smell.
By 3 days, you're starting to smell. The smell is going to give it away.
Did give away.
So people can train themselves to breathe very lightly, and you don't even notice their breath. In fact, I think of what Melissa said last weekend. We had Hudson with us, and Hudson, as a 2-year-old, his breathing is so shallow that you really got to pay attention to make sure that he's still breathing. We know of lots of neurotoxins that can paralyze the body, but if you feel a pulse, you know that they're still alive. By the same token, my dad tells a story about his grandpa, my great-grandpa, who was an electrician, and he took the full electrical shock of a substation. And for 2 weeks, they could not hear his heartbeat.
Oh my God.
He was breathing, he was alive, but they could not hear his heartbeat at all. And so that's why for ancient people, the body, they had to be dead for 3 days before they would put them in the tomb. In medieval times, they might bury a body, but that's oftentimes why for the first week, they'd have a string down into the coffin with a little bell at the top that hang from the tombstone, so that a person could ring it to say, I'm not actually dead. But after a week, they take that bell away because that person would be dead at that point. This is the whole reason that within our culture, we have the wake. So you don't have the funeral for a couple of days until after a person has died, because there was that 3 days of sitting with the body to make sure it was dead before you have the funeral that pronounces them dead.
Brings up the point, Sam.
Yes.
It's my understanding that the whalers that are mentioned are hired by the family to come to help the mourning process. But yet we see that the wailers are already there before Jairus and Christ even get back.
Yeah. So that means that someone in Jairus's family had the wailers on standby. They already knew that Jairus's daughter was going to die, and they were prepared to move into that 3 days of grieving until they would clinically call his daughter dead and then they would bury her. In John's gospel, the reason that when Jesus goes to raise Lazarus, it's the 4th day. That's why he's in the tomb. He's already had the 3 days of being dead, and they put him in the tomb because they know he's dead. So the fact that the mourners are there means that, one, Jairus was wealthy, which as the leader of the synagogue, he probably would have been. 2, it means that someone in Jairus's household, Jairus's wife, the head of the servants, whoever it was, they believe the child is going to die. So they've already contacted the mourners and had them ready. So that the moment that she's dead, they can do this public reality of we're acknowledging the dead. And, to a certain degree, that sounds harsh and maybe even crass to our culture, but that was meant to be an act of kindness. So you'd have public wailers, people who would publicly mourn because the family, how many people do you know that whenever someone they love dies, they're just numb? They can't cry. And sometimes even when death happens, you find people laughing and having the wrong emotions at that moment. So by having public mourners, it was a way of telling the community this death has happened and we're grieving, and it keeps the family from having to be the ones publicly out there doing that grieving. Does that make sense?
Kind of like what we do pre-funeral arrangements. Susan and I both have our
Pre-planned funeral arrangements is kind of a way of dealing with some of this. So he had pre-planned funeral, or someone did.
And I got my pre-planned party.
Pre-planned party.
I'll be partying with you.
But to Melissa's point, while this passage doesn't go all the way to that point, there is a big question that for the most part, we have unanswered. And that is, when a person is actually dead, what happens to them? For the Jewish people, they did not believe that you could separate a person's body, who they are physically, from their mind, who they are mentally, and from their soul. So the reality is, once a person is dead, they believe that you are completely dead. They did not have this notion where somehow your soul might go to another place after you die.
Well, that depended on whether you were a Sadducee or a Pharisee, because Pharisees believed in resurrection. The Sadducees are the ones who believe that you were dead.
They didn't believe in a resurrection, but that they believed that somehow, in a way that didn't fully understand, and that we don't fully understand, that God was going to take those who believed in him and lived a right life and recreate them. Now, when that happened, they didn't know. It's very clear that they saw it as something that was going to happen in the future. When the resurrection occurs, when you bring back all your people who died faithfully in you. So they didn't believe that that was possible. There were many Jews who believed that the resurrection was possible. And many of them believed that it was going to happen, not just possible, but that those who were faithful, it was going to happen for them. That was a belief of many Jews. But the question is, what happens between your moment of death and whenever that resurrection happens? The Greco-Roman world had a different understanding based on Greek philosophy. And oftentimes Greek philosophy, as the simplified understanding is, we are meat sacks with a soul in it. That this body is not the same thing as the soul, and that the soul is what lives on beyond the body. And so there was this notion of many people, because of that, they saw the flesh as the broken, sinful thing, and the soul was not sinful. And that if somehow you could discipline the body, train the body, even scourge the body, that it would allow the soul to be glorious as God created it to be. And of course, that's a dichotomy that the church denounced often. I just finished a book, for those of you who are on Facebook, I posted about a church history book that I just read. And over and over and over again, the church denounces this notion that we have to beat or mortify the flesh. In the same, there are people who began to believe, even like you brought up Elijah earlier. You know, when Elijah is talking to all those prophets of Baal, he tells them to cut themselves. That they believe that somehow by cutting themselves and letting themselves bleed, that they were going to make themselves more worthy to their God. There were Christians who took that same notion on, but that's because they had a dichotomy of flesh and spirit. When Paul talks about the flesh, he's talking not about something that's separate from our spirit or our soul. He's talking about the fact that we as spiritual beings are corrupt. And that apart from God's restoration, even our soul is corrupt. Even our spirit is corrupt within us. And so Paul would not have that dichotomy. But a lot of people would believe and still believe that because of what Jesus says on the cross, I tell you today, you will be with me in paradise. There's a lot of ways of interpreting that passage. But because of what Jesus says, there are people who believe that the moment that the body dies, the soul is immediately with Christ. As if you are fully yourself in your soul without your body. Well, the church, the Jewish people would not have that understanding. So they would say that because this body decays, the soul waiting for the resurrection sleeps. That's where this notion comes from. Is because the Jewish people did not see a separation of body and soul. They just said that the soul essentially goes into a stasis point, that it just kind of sits out there waiting for the resurrection. And that's where the notion of soul sleep comes from. Does that make sense, Melissa?
Yes.
Now, whether or not that's actually what happens when a person dies or not, I don't know. In fact, I don't think we'll know until we get there. And whether you sleep or whether your soul dies with you and God just recreates your soul with your body at the resurrection, I don't know that it's really going to matter.
Well, see, that's what I've always heard. Well, not always heard, but that's what I've read and heard here in the last 15 years. Because a lot of people are still confused on when they die, what happens to them, you know? Do we go, and then there's a lot of people that talk about, you know, they're there walking in the streets with their family members and it's like, So my theory and thought on this is I am thankful that God sent Jesus to do all of this stuff for me. So I don't have to worry about it. I just know that I believe in him. So when I do die, I know where I'm gonna end up eventually.
When we get there, we will know.
Yes.
Whether we are there instantaneously, and body, soul, spirit all get there instantaneously.
Yes.
Whether the soul sleeps and then at the end of the age, the resurrection happens and then we get there, or whether we are moved beyond time like God is beyond time, and then we see all of it play out with our bodies still dead down there decaying. I don't know, but it also won't matter. Because we'll be there and we will know. But the key thing that I want to say is death is real. Death is a consequence of sin. Death is the enemy. But God also turns this enemy into something that allows us to experience eternity. Jesus conquers death, and as we got 5 minutes left, let's finish this story. The rest of chapter, or verse 40 through 43. After he put them all out, he took the child's father and mother and the disciples who were with him, so Peter, James, and John, and he went in where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, Talitha kum, which means, little girl, I say to you, get up. Immediately the girl stood up and began to walk around. She was 12 years old. At this, they were completely astonished. He gave strict orders not to let anyone know about this and told them to give her something to eat. So, what do you notice? What questions does it make you ask as we kind of wrap?
First thing I noticed was before he ever saw the girl, Jesus already knew that she was only asleep, or that the effect of what he was going to do would be make it as though she were only asleep. So, it's not like he looked at her and got, oh, I know what this is. She's this or that. No, he knew in advance because they had to go into the place where she was, and he had already spoken that she was already asleep before that.
Yeah, Jesus had a very clear understanding of what he was going to do. And he also had a very clear understanding of the story he wanted told. Like you said, he tells everybody she's sleeping. He tells the mourners and the grieving, why are you here? She's sleeping. And for all practical purposes, until the gospel is written after Jesus is resurrected, everyone just believes that she fell asleep, Jesus came, he healed her. They would believe that a healing took place, but they would not see her as see this as him bringing someone back from the dead. That's a very clear misdirection. Except for the people who were there, who understood the mother, the father, Peter, James, and John. Those 5 people absolutely understood that this was a bringing someone back from the dead. For everyone else, until this story is told in its entirety after Jesus's resurrection, this was a story of a little girl who got really sick, fell into a deep sleep, maybe what we might call a coma even. And Jesus heals her of that. It's still a healing. It's still a miracle. But most people don't understand the level of the miracle until after his resurrection. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think an act like this crosses the line from being merely a prophet to being the Son of God. And he wasn't quite ready to let everybody know that just yet, because he had more ministry to do, and he knew that the more he came out, the more opposition he was going to face. from the Sadducees and Pharisees and church leaders.
Yeah, I think that that's one of the key points. They're calling him a teacher, and he's okay with that, because a teacher does bring a level of notoriety. It brings a level of commotion and crowd. But the moment that it gets out that he has officially raised somebody from the dead, as Kevin pointed out earlier, we only had 2 prophets that did that.
Yeah.
Elijah and Elisha. This would elevate Jesus to a whole new level and bring a whole new level of circus with him. Let alone if he actually starts letting people call him Messiah, the Son of God. Because just at the beginning of this chapter, you know, the demoniac says, "You are the Son of God," and he silences them. He's like, no. It's not that this isn't true. It's just that Jesus wants to do more ministry, and if this gets out, his ability to do that ministry gets hampered tremendously.
And then there's another aspect that we could hypothetical, but it could very well be true that with what they just went through, he really didn't want Jairus and his wife to have to deal with the Pharisees and the Sadducees at this moment. You know what I'm saying?
There is a level of care that Jesus is showing to Jairus and his wife and their daughter. That if this is just a sickness, yesterday our grandson Hayden was sent home from preschool because he had a fever. And they said, he's got to stay home because we're sending him home with a fever. He can't come back till Thursday. That, it's one thing if Jesus heals this girl of a fever. People will let Jairus and there'll still be commotion, but they'll give them some space. It's something very different if Jesus brought her back from the dead. And the level of attention that's going to cause Jairus and his wife and this family. And so, yeah, I think that there's a level in which Jesus is giving a misdirection so that it cares for this family.
Yes.
Now, the other side of that is pragmatically speaking, and which is why Melissa asked the question about soul sleep. This girl has not been dead long enough that Jesus couldn't call her soul back to her body and bring her back to full life. But the full impact of this miracle, Jesus wants it to stay quiet for a little while longer. And I think that sometimes we need to realize that God does things that are just for us. With the woman who was bleeding and she had been unclean, the public nature of that healing was necessary for her to be restored to the community. For this healing, for this miracle, it could just be the mother and the father who understood that. And then some of his disciples, because his disciples would disseminate this to the other disciples. Sometimes God does the miraculous for the community. Sometimes God does the miraculous for the individual. And sometimes God does the miraculous just for a close-knit group. But always, as we've seen all throughout Mark's gospel, when he does the miraculous, it's so that people will believe and put a deeper trust in him.
And don't you think what you're saying is he might have set all this up by saying she was only sleeping so that they would not, that whole concept of raising her from the dead wouldn't come into question?
I think there's a sense in which Jesus absolutely knew what was going on. He absolutely knew what was happening. And while on a technicality, she was dead, to call her asleep was also an accurate reality because he could bring her back to this. And it set the stage for an understanding of just how powerful Jesus was, but it also set this family up to be able to care for their little group. Because otherwise, she might have been taken before the Sanhedrin and before the Sadducees and the Pharisees, and there had been interrogation and so I think that Jesus very strategically says she is sleeping when the report of her death first comes. He again reiterates the sleeping notion as he sends them out. But then again, his words of little girl, I say to you, get up. The intriguing thing for me is that the God of the universe has the authority over death, like the way we do to just go wake someone from a sleep. You know, the last couple of weeks, we've experienced a lot of surgeries and major things. Earlier when we were taking up our prayer requests, you know, the notion of replacing a valve in a heart. And if that's a 24 hours and send them home kind of thing, that's crazy. That is crazy when you start to think about the level of skill and knowledge and ability that we now have in our world. But for the Bible to say that Jesus can treat death like you're just asleep, that's pretty amazing. Final thoughts as we get ready to pray. Then let's pray. Heavenly Father, Lord, I thank you for this reminder that you care for us uniquely and that you never treat our situation like you do others. You do exactly what we need in that moment for us and our situation. Not what you did for another, or not what you even did for the same situation in someone else. And Lord, that you care for this family enough to keep them from experiencing the craziness. But Lord, you also are willing to do the miraculous. And Lord, I'm grateful to know that you have power over death. And Lord, whether when my time here is done, whether I just completely disappear and you remake me, whether my soul sleeps until you call me forth, or whether it's something completely different. Lord, I trust you. As you said to Jairus, I only believe. Lord, may we live lives that only believe in you. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen. All right, you want to end the recording? So next week we will start with chapter 6.